Hello and welcome to the Craft Beer Corner. For today's review, we are jumping into a couple barrel-aged imperial stouts. I love stouts. I love barrel-aged beers, and stouts pair very well with barrel aging, and imperial is just more to love. So I'm very excited to jump into two beers that I have never had. I've had one beer ever from one of the brewers, and this will be the first I've ever had from them. And as you all know, I love trying new beers from brewers I've never tried before. So today ought to be pretty fun. So firstly, we're going to be starting with Woodland Empire's County Stout. This is an imperial stout that's been whiskey barrel aged, and they added cocoa and cold brew coffee. This one clocks in at 14% ABV, and they are based out of Boise, Idaho. For number two, we have Wyndridge Farm Brewing's Bourbon Barrel-Aged Imperial Stout. That's the name of the beer, and the name of the beer tells you everything you need to know. It is a bourbon barrel-aged imperial stout. This one clocks in at 13.9% ABV, and they're based in Dallastown, Pennsylvania. So two big barrel-aged imperial stouts, only 0.1% ABV apart. So this ought to be about as even footing as it gets. Though one has cocoa and cold brew coffee, one's just a standard stout that's been barrel-aged. So we'll see what difference that makes. Nonetheless, let's get jumping right in, starting with the Woodland Empire's Ada County Stout. That one clocks in at 14% ABV. Okay, so jumping right into the first beer of today's barrel-aged Imperial Stout review, we've got Woodland Empire's Ada County Stout. This is the Imperial Stout that's been whiskey barrel-aged and also has added cocoa and cold brew coffee. They do state specifically it is raw cocoa and specifically cold brew Necker coffee. So that's the very detailed specifics on what all they've done to this. Clocks in at 14% ABV, and they are based out of Boise, Idaho. So to start, obviously not much in terms of label art, so to speak. It's just a very clean design on the can. It's kind of a gold color can, very clean design. So not much to talk about there, so let's get this cracked. All right, and poured right in the glass. Oh yeah, very dark beer. It maybe isn't pouring out quite as thickly as I thought that it would, but it's got some resistance. I would have expected to see a bit more resistance than that on a 14%, but that's okay. It does appear to be quite effervescent. Formed ahead to start, we'll see how long that sticks around. I can tell you, I can smell this beer from here. I'm about a foot away from it, and it's very pungent. That barrel aging is really doing its part. I can smell it quite clearly, quite distinctly. So visually, absolutely pitch black as expected. It was very dark pouring out. There's a lot of fermentables in here, so no surprise there. Head is actually holding okay now, and I don't see as much activity in terms of carbonation coming up, so maybe this head will retain reasonably well. We shall soon find out, but let's actually get over it for a sniff. Yeah, it's very, very pungent. That whiskey barrel is really the dominant aroma here. You can get just a hint of the coffee. I'm not really picking up the chocolate, and really I'm not picking anything up from the malt base. It's really all whiskey and just a little hint of the coffee. But it smells fantastic. So without further ado, let's jump right in. Oh, oh, oh. Oh, that's a big beer, and it's really good. This is really, really good. Honestly, I drink a lot of stouts and a lot of imperial stouts, and I drink many of them that are barrel aged and many of them that have other added ingredients, but this is easily one of the best I've had in the last probably year and a half's worth of beers like this I've had. This is exquisite. The whiskey barrel comes through quite clearly. It comes through clearly in the aroma and on the flavor, and it pairs exceptionally well with this malt base. Now, I couldn't really pick up the malt base because the whiskey presence was so massive, but I could pick up a bit of that coffee. And there's just this beautiful balance of flavors in this beer. and they're all bold. It's very, very pungent. The whiskey is what hits you first. It's massive whiskey. And then that slowly dials back, and then the coffee starts to slowly creep its way up, and it intensifies. And it comes up very, very slowly. The whiskey is bam, right out of the gate. The coffee, you got to wait for the whiskey to get out of the way a little bit. It takes a few seconds, and then it slowly creeps in, and then it becomes just as intense. The cocoa is very much underneath the intensity of the whiskey and the coffee, but it's got this nice backbone that really, for me, is marrying quite well with the malt bill. Now, the malt bill itself is not super discernible just due to the pungency of the flavors in here, but it's clearly very deeply roasted malts, and that cocoa that they added is absolutely playing its part, and it's playing in tandem with that malt bill, and it's pairing exceptionally well with that whiskey and exceptionally well with that coffee. The balance on this, I can't overstate this, for me, is just an absolute home run. I am loving this. A coffee beer done right, especially a big stout, and one that's been whiskey barrel aged, and just getting the balance of everything right. It's a really good ingredient bill, but to nail exactly the right ratios of everything, that's much easier said than done. And Woodland Empire has done an exceptional job here. I'm going to jump in for body and mouthfeel and explore this flavor development again. Well, no super surprise here. It's 14% ABV, and the body is very big, very big. It's not quite as heavy as I would have expected in this ABV range, but it's heavier than the vast majority of the beers. I'd say it's not quite as heavy as some that are a little lower ABV and others that are in this same kind of general range, but it's big. This is much bigger, more robust than your average beer. Mouthfeel. It's got a little resistance to it, but it's not super thick. It's not syrupy. It's got thickness. So you know you're drinking a bigger, thicker, heavier stout, but it's not milkshake-like. It's not syrupy. It has resistance without being super viscous. And, you know, frankly, I think it pairs well with the weight of the body. It's got a nice balance between the body and the mouthfeel, and the two work together very well. If you run it around the palate and agitate, it does give the sensation that it's getting creamier, but it doesn't really. It's really just making some bubbles, and then that immediately gets out of the way. It doesn't really thicken, richen, kind of silky cream up at all. And that's not a good thing or a bad thing, just telling you that for your information. So I'm going to jump back in for one more sip here for final thoughts. It's so big, it's so intense. That whiskey, and it lingers there for a good 5-6 seconds. Then the coffee slowly starts to creep in. Now that's picking up to the same intensity as the whiskey. And then they're on an even playing field after a few more seconds. Then the cocoa is riding underneath. Just this beautiful, beautiful cocoa. And I can tell you where the malt bill does come through is really after all of the independent players come in and make their presence known. There's this subtle, roasty, almost edge of burnt. It's not smoky, but it's just before it takes on this smoke-like quality. It's very deeply roasted. Very, very nice. Folks, this is a fantastic beer. I'm a big fan of this one. The finish too is quite long, and you can keep tasting all of these flavors that they put in. I can still taste that barrel clearly. I can still taste that coffee clearly. I can still taste that cocoa clearly, and I can taste that roasty malt underneath, just putting it all together, that beautiful, beautiful support for all these wonderful ingredients they put in. This is a fine, fine stout. I'm going to take my time, sip on this, come up with my scores. When we come back, we will get to the second beer of today's review, and that is Wyndridge Farm Brewing's Bourbon Barrel-Aged Imperial Stout. That one clocks in at 13.9% ABV. Okay, for the second beer of today's review, we have got Wyndridge Farm Brewing's Bourbon Barrel-Aged Imperial Stout, which is aptly named Bourbon Barrel-Aged Imperial Stout. This one clocks in at 0.1% lower than the first at 13.9, and they are based out of Dallastown, Pennsylvania. Just as with the first beer, this one has a very kind of plain Jane label. It's got a nice design, but nothing over the top to really write home about. And in contrast to the first beer, there's no additives in this. It's just the beer, and it's been bourbon barrel aged. So the first had cocoa and cold brew coffee and was whiskey barrel. This is specifically bourbon whiskey barrel and also an imperial stout. So without further ado, we're going to get this cracked. And this is indeed the first beer I've ever had by Wyndridge Farm Brewing. So I'm very excited. So let's get this poured right in the glass. Oh, that's even darker and thicker than the first one. Yeah, it looks quite a bit darker and quite a bit thicker. I'm going to agitate this a fair bit now to give it a chance to form a reasonable head. Slow it down. Yeah, that did form quite nicely. I didn't quite get the full can in there because I wanted to give it a chance to form a head, and it did quite well. Holding it up visually as expected, it's absolutely pitch black. There's not a hint of light getting through that. It is pitch black. Pitch black. Yeah. Nothing much more to add there. Did form quite a nice head. And I can tell you, that first one I could smell from about a foot away. This one, if I get within a few inches, I can smell it, but the aroma's not, a foot pungency kind of tier. But let's get right up over it and see what it's in store. Oh yeah. Yeah, it smells quite nice. I'll tell you, you do smell the malt, but the bourbon is really what comes through the most prominently. No question about it. That barrel, its presence is really, really, really strong in this beer, just as with the first one. And that's not a bad thing. I like that in my barrel-aged beers. It's more expensive. It takes more time. You pay more for it. Everything about it. If you're going to take the time to do it, just go big or go home. And it looks like they did exactly that. So, yeah. Smells great. Looks great. Head is settled down nicely. Let's jump right in. Ooh. Oh, that's very nice. Ooh. Yeah. That's lovely bourbon. Lovely bourbon. And I'm pleased to report that the malts that they put in here, they are super, super richly roasted. I mean, deep, deep roast. This is one that's on the edge of burned, so it has elements that remind me of a French roast coffee, that really almost bordering on a smoky quality about it without tasting like smoke. It's not like Rauch beer or Scotch Wee Heavy that's got those peated malts. It's not like that. It's just a really intense roast to the malt, and it pairs wonderfully with this bourbon. The bourbon really is what hits you up front, and as to be expected, it does impart some interesting flavors from that barrel. So you do get a little booziness to it, which I like in a big ABV beer anyway, particularly if it's barrel aged. It really plays the part of the spirit that they chose for the barrel, and no exception here. So I'm getting undercurrents of really deep molasses. I'm getting a little hint of vanilla, and I'm getting what probably reminds me most closely of raw cane sugar, kind of paired with molasses and vanilla. And that's really the prominent notes that are coming through from that bourbon side, aside from the pure essence of bourbon itself. And then just layered on top of this intensely roasted malt bill. Very chocolatey underneath, very earthy, very roasty, very kind of edge of burned. It's not smoky, but it puts you in mind of that. Really, really well put together. Tastes fantastic. So let's go ahead and get this topped off. Got a nice little residual floating pad on top here of that head. Did quite well. Always curious to see how long they stick around on an imperial stout, or stout really poured at home. They don't typically do the best, but this one's doing a good job, and it tastes great. So let's jump in for another sip for body and mouthfeel. The body on this one's not quite as heavy as on the first. I'd say it's on the border between medium and medium heavy. much less pronounced than you would anticipate for this ABV range. But it still has enough weight. It's got presence, so you still know you're drinking a big, big Imperial Stout. In terms of mouthfeel, this one's got a little more resistance than our first beer did. It's still not as viscous as I would expect in this ABV range, but it's nice. And frankly, for a little less present body, the mouthfeel is perfectly cohesive. So it really feels appropriate and matches the body. One's not out of kilter with the other. It feels right. Even though it's a little less than I would anticipate in both categories, it feels right. I'm going to jump in again for flavor development and finish. This is very nice. I love the balance. Let's jump in for final thoughts here. Yeah, it's big bourbon. Big bourbon out of the gate. It's huge. And within that first 2-3 seconds as it's intensifying, the malt comes in just behind it. So it's just a couple seconds behind, and they're both kind of blooming into one another. It's really delicious. And after about the 5, 6, 7 second mark, that's when both of these flavors kind of intermingle fully, and they're holding their peak intensity. And it really holds for quite a long time. And then this roasty quality comes from out of the grain. All those notes we talked about. Same thing with the bourbon. All the qualities that I mentioned prior, they're all mixing here. So you have all of this vanilla, all of this molasses, all of this raw cane sugar, all of this kind of slight coffee-like quality, the French roast bean, that edge, that really deep, rich, and it's all just blending, and it's holding intensity, and it holds for a good 15-20 seconds before it starts its slow descent. It does have a long finish on this one. The flavors really linger around the palate. Even though it's not syrupy and it's not as thick as you would anticipate, the intensity of flavor is so great that it really does coat the palate and it really does stick around. This is a fine, fine beer. I'm a big fan of this one as well. I'm going to take my time, sip on this, come up with my scores. When we come back, we will get both beers ranked from top to bottom. Okay, now we're going to get both of these delicious beers ranked, starting with the Woodland Empire County Stout, Imperial Stout, whiskey barrel aged with added cocoa and cold brew coffee. They're out of Boise, Idaho. This one clocked in at 14% ABV. Starting with the aroma, this was one of those beers you could smell from 1.5 to 2 feet away. It was positively pungent. The whiskey barrel really came through, and when you get right up on it, you could still smell the malt bill in there, and you could pick up a little bit of the coffee nuance. Chocolate got a little lost in the aroma, but it was pungent, smelled fantastic. It gets a 10 out of 10. For the taste, I loved it. This was an exceptionally well put together beer. The whiskey came on strong, and then the cold brew kind of sneaked up and matched its intensity, and the chocolate was pairing with the malts underneath. The balance of the flavors was fantastic. All of them came through, and I really enjoyed what I was tasting. It gets a perfect 10 out of 10. For the body in this beer was not light by any stretch of the imagination, but it was a little bit less robust than I anticipated for 14% ABV. Still well above average though. It gets an 8 out of 10. For the mouthfeel, similar story. I did expect a little more viscosity, though to be fair, when I was pouring it, it didn't look as thick as I anticipated. Don't get me wrong, it wasn't a thin beer. Just again, for a beer at this ABV and for this style, I expected a lot more resistance, a lot more thickness than did come through. Still above average here as well. It gets an 8 out of 10. For the finish on this beer was very long. The whiskey really helped kind of push it out. And indeed, even the coffee and the malts and the cocoa that they put in there, the nibs, how they all paired. But the whiskey was really front and center, helping extend it out. You don't always get super long finishes on stouts. The bigger ABV ones tend to help the cause, and certainly with additives. But it was very nice long finish. It gets a 9 out of 10. For the head and retention, this beer did pretty good for being poured at home. Bigger beers like this that aren't off of a tap, especially if a nitro tap's set up or from a bar on a nitro tap, that's really where these beers are at home in making their heads. But this one did okay. You know, I had to be pretty vigorous, but it formed an okay head. It stuck around an okay time. It was above average. It gets a 7 out of 10. For the appearance, This was exactly as expected. Just a huge ABV Imperial Stout. It was pitch black. It gets a 10 out of 10. For the balance, I mentioned this in terms of the flavor, and that's really where the bulk of my kind of balance critique is going to come from anyway. There's balance in other facets, but the flavor in this was just exceptionally well balanced. At first I thought, okay, it's going to be a little more whiskey forward than everything. Oh, well, the coffee's not. And then everything just kind of came through and intensified and then worked together with a classic malt bill. I loved it. It gets a 10 out of 10. Feeling in the intangible. Subjectively, I love this beer. I only took a few points off in a few categories. You know, that's just how it came out. But overall, subjectively, I loved it. It gets a 10 out of 10. Finally, as an example of the style. Circling back one more time, I did take some points off in a few categories, notably body and mouthfeel, and I finish lost one, no big deal. Head retention, it is what it is at home, but frankly, this beer was positively delicious. This was an exquisitely crafted Imperial Stout with additives, and they all played their part. I didn't take any points off as an example, so it gets a 10 there, which brings the total score on Woodland Empire's Ada County Stout to a 92 out of 100. Well above average beer, well worth seeking if you're a fan of the style, especially if you like barrel-aged and or coffee stouts. This was the perfect marriage of all of my favorite stout kind of sub-varieties and just executed masterfully. Moving on to beer number 2. This is Wyndridge Farm Brewing's Bourbon Barrel-Aged Imperial Stout. It is exactly what it's named. Clocks in at 13.9% ABV, and they are based out of Dallastown, Pennsylvania. Starting with the aroma. The aroma on this beer was nice. It was certainly more pungent than your average Imperial Stout, but compared to the first beer, it was in a whole different ball field. Still above average though, it gets an 8 out of 10. For the taste, I really enjoyed it. There were no additives, there were really no punches pulled, no gimmicks, just a bourbon barrel aging of a well-crafted Imperial Stout. And frankly, the bourbon came through beautifully. The malt bill they selected was really nice. Very rich roasted malts in there, which really helped add just this layered nuance to it that I really appreciated. You don't always have to have all these additives. I mean, barrel aging, frankly, is enough of a nice treat to any beer style that, you know, you don't have to put in other ingredients. I'm never going to turn them down, but this was a great example of how to barrel age an Imperial Stout and use quality malt ingredients and have just as enjoyable of a beer drinking experience as some that have other additives. For the taste, I give it a 9 out of 10. For the body on this one, granted they're only 0.1% ABV apart, 14 versus 13.9. The body on this one was even less robust than anticipated comparative to the first one. It was really just in the average range, high end, but just average. It gets a 6 out of 10. For the mouthfeel, same story. Both of these beers, their body and their mouthfeel, they went well together, but they both got the same score and for the same reasons. And this one really just fell in the average territory. This was above average, but mouthfeel on this one, it gets a 6. For the finish on this beer was quite a bit longer than I anticipated. The flavors were not as pungent as in the first beer, and the cold brew coffee really helped intensify on this one. This was just the base malts plus that bourbon barrel. But the finish was really quite nice. The bourbon did linger around, and these really intense malts did as well. I give it a 9 out of 10. For the head and retention, this one did a little bit better than the first beer. I was a little more aggressive, and it did a little bit better. Not crazy, but it did do better. It's above average. It gets an 8 out of 10. For the appearance, as expected, classic Imperial Stout, pitch black, it gets a 10 out of 10. For the balance on this beer, even though it really had no other additive, it was just the bourbon barrel aging of this beer, the balance was exceptional. I thought that the bourbon was in the right intensity and the malts really came through. You don't always get super intense qualities out of the malts in a stout bill, but this one was, and it paired very well with that bourbon. I give it a perfect 10 out of 10. Feeling in the intangible. I loved it. What can I say? I'm a sucker for stouts, Imperial Stouts, barrel-aged beers, and a well-done barrel-aged Imperial Stout is just a thing of beauty. This was no exception, and it gets a 10 out of 10 for me subjectively. Finally, as an example of the style. This one lost a few more points in some notable categories than the first beer. As such, even though I really enjoyed it and I thought it was a very strong example of just a classic barrel-aged Imperial, I did dock 1 point, which brings the example of the style to a 9 out of 10. And that brings the total score on Wyndridge Farm Brewing's Bourbon Barrel-Aged Imperial Stout to an 85 out of 100. So again, well above average, and we're only looking at 7 points apart here, a 92 and an 85. Both of these beers, if you're fans of barrel-aged beers or barrel-aged stouts in particular, or imperials, you can't go wrong with them. And if you're a big fan of coffee stouts as well, this one's really got that added bonus because that cold brew coffee was really quite special in this beer. Folks, that's today's review. As always, I do sincerely appreciate you tuning in today. Please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And if you want to stay in the loop when our videos go live to YouTube, you can just click the notification bell icon. It's right next to the subscribe button. Until next time, keep it beer, keep it craft. We'll see you on the next one. Cheers.